Picture yourself right now, letting the noise of the day simply drift away. Long ago, the world was filled with quiet. There were no phones, no quick lights, only the slow, deep rhythm of the earth. Tonight, we will drift into this quiet. We're not looking for great wars or loud kings. Instead, we look for a hidden, soft force, the simple pattern of collective inaction. This is the mystery of why powerful civilizations, when faced with clear and gentle warnings, often chose to close their eyes and accelerate their own demise. We invite you to relax now, letting your thoughts become as slow as the moon rising over ancient ruins. This journey will be a soft, gentle observation of these ancient shadows. We will look at societies that were told the dangers of the changing climate, of drying rivers, of too many people and too few trees, but who kept walking the same path. Their stories are not tales of sudden disaster, but of a quiet, slow ignoring. We will move softly from the remote islands where great statues fell to the massive stone-filled deserts, where rivers dried up forever. Every ruin we visit tonight has a voice, and it whispers the same forgotten truth. The real danger is not the warning, but the failure to listen. Let the echoes of these lost voices become the soft pillow for your mind. You are safe here, ready to learn the secrets of collapse and the quiet hope of survival. First light in deep caves, we begin our gentle journey far away, floating softly over a tiny, lonely triangle of land in the immense blue ocean. This is Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, a world once full of life, now famous for its silent, staring stone giants. The first canoes arrived long ago, bringing the first people to this empty, beautiful place. When they stepped ashore, the island was green, covered in giant palm trees that reached high toward the sky. The people were full of hope and energy, ready to build a new life. This was the first happy light in their deep cave of discovery. The island people started cutting down the trees. They needed the strong wood to build their homes, to make their cooking fires, and soon to move their giant statues, the moai, from the quarries to the coast. Every year they cut more and more. The trees were the strong, quiet keepers of the soil, holding the water and the earth together. The first warning was a small one, the quiet sound of a seed failing to grow, a small stream drying up. The people saw the island thinning, but they loved their great statues more. The building of the moai became more important than the trees. The statues were a source of great pride and status. They represented the power of the clans. The need to carve and move an even bigger statue was a fever, a collective dream they could not wake up from. They knew they were running out of wood. There were songs and stories that warned them about the bare hills and the eroding soil. But the warnings were small voices against the loud, exciting work of the stonecutters. The islanders were collectively choosing the short-term goal of vanity, a bigger statue, over the long-term goal of survival. The deforestation became extreme, turning the green island into a cracked red desert. The palm forest did not just disappear, it was systematically removed, piece by piece, by people who knew they were running out. When the last large trees were gone, the people could no longer make big canoes to fish the deep sea, and the soil washed away, making farming impossible. The first clear choice for collective suicide was made with the small, quiet sound of the last tree falling down a long time ago. The statues stand today, silent witnesses to this great self-inflicted wound. They show us how a society can focus so heavily on one specific cultural goal, the moai, that it becomes utterly blind to the fundamental needs of life, like food and shelter. The people knew. The warnings were clear. But the pattern of collapse is often a slow, simple refusal to change the single path that is causing the problem. They accelerated their own end because they could not stop looking up at the sky-facing stone giants and start looking down at the disappearing dirt. This story of Rapa Nui's environmental collapse is a soft echo that reaches us across the ocean, across the years. It reminds us that every resource crisis is also a crisis of priority. The people of Easter Island did not die because of a sudden storm. They fell because they could not agree that the forest was more important than their cultural competition. Let this first lesson settle gently into your mind. A quiet story of the first light that dimmed itself. Cities that vanished at night. Our journey moves now far across the sea to the red, dry canyons of the American Southwest. Here, long ago lived the ancestral Puebloans, also known as the Anasazi. They were master builders who carved and created amazing villages inside the high cliffs and mesas. Places like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon were once great, bustling centres, proof of a complex society that knew how to work with a hard land. They knew the rhythms of the arid Southwest deeply, relying on seasonal rains to feed their crops of corn, beans and squash. The warning here was not the sound of a falling tree, but the absence of sound. The quiet, gentle silence of rain that did not come. The Puebloans had built their lives around the idea of steady, reliable water. They were keenly aware of the long periods of drought, and their early communities were flexible, ready to move when the water moved. But as their societies grew bigger and their stone buildings became more permanent and grand, they began to lose their flexibility. They focused too much on the fixed spot, the Great Canyon, ignoring the knowledge that the desert demanded constant, humble movement. The clear warning came in a series of great droughts lasting many years. The climate was changing. The rain that fed their complex irrigation, canals and massive storage systems failed year after year. The leaders of the great houses in Chaco Canyon continued their grand building projects and their ritual feasts, hoping that bigger temples would bring bigger rain. They chose to believe that their spiritual status and architectural complexity would somehow defy the slow, quiet power of the weather. They ignored the small communities that had already packed up and moved to better areas. This refusal to acknowledge the change accelerated the collapse. The large, centralized, beautiful villages that they loved became traps. It takes much more food and water to support thousands of people in one fixed spot. When the water truly failed, the social stress became too much. The people did not wait for a loud war. They simply and quietly left. They packed what they could carry and melted away, seeking water elsewhere. The stone cities were not destroyed. They were abandoned. The ancestral Puebloans offer a silent, powerful lesson in infrastructure obsolescence. They had invested so much time and effort into fixed, complex water systems that they forgot the simple, core truth. Water is the master, and the land is always changing. Their collective choice was to hold on to the grand dream of their fixed stone city, rather than accepting the necessary humble truth of mobility. This societal collapse was not a bomb, but a slow, quiet walk into the night. When you look at the beautiful abandoned cliff dwellings today, remember this. The people were not stupid. They were simply too attached to their own fixed idea of perfection. They ignored the quiet knowledge of the drought and accelerated their vanishing because they could not make the tough mobile choice. Let this memory of the silent vanishing cities settle, gently, reminding us that sometimes the true strength of a society lies in its willingness to humbly embrace change. Simple symbols carved in stone. Let us now drift south, into the deep, misty jungles of Central America, where the great Mayan civilization once ruled. The Maya were masters of time. They watched the stars, they created a complex, beautiful calendar, and they wrote everything down in elegant, simple symbols carved onto stone monuments called stelae. They knew the patterns of the years better than almost any other people. Their cities were massive, green, and powerful, fueled by heavy seasonal rains. The warning for the Maya was written right on their stones. Their own detailed records showed clear evidence of recurring drought cycles. They were not ignorant of the risk of water failure. They recorded it in beautiful detail. Yet, as their cities grew, their leaders began a frantic competition to build more massive pyramids and carve more steely, proclaiming their own greatness and power over rain. The The political competition became more important than the simple facts written in stone. The collapse of the classic Maya was not an invasion, but a kind of political and environmental overextension. The kings accelerated their demise by intensifying the exact practices that were causing the damage. They cut down the surrounding forests to make lime plaster for their massive buildings, which increased soil erosion and reduced the local humidity needed to bring rain. This deforestation was a clear, collective choice to sacrifice the environment for monumentality. The simple symbols they carved tell a story of hubris. The kings kept building, kept carving, and kept draining the resources, even as the cycles of drought became longer and more intense. The collapse accelerated because of a lack of social and political adaptation. The people relied utterly on their powerful, centralized kings to control the weather. When the long multi-year droughts came and the king's prayers and pyramids failed, the faith in the system completely broke down. The great stone cities were not wiped out. They quietly crumbled back into the jungle. The people simply walked away from the grand, water-intensive centres and returned to smaller, more sustainable village life. The Maya's story is the sound of a civilization failing to heed its own recorded history. The wisdom of the past was carved in stone, but the pride of the present prevented them from reading the truth. This is a soft, deep lesson in historical blindness. Let this gentle tale of the Mayan kings remind us that having the data is not the same as having the wisdom. The most important lesson written on their ancient stones is that when the simple facts of survival are replaced by the loud, proud symbols of power, the outcome is a collective choice to leave the light and sink into the shadows. Quiet objects left by old hands. Now we travel far north, to the cold, icy coast of Greenland, where a group of European settlers, the Norse, arrived a long time ago. These were people of the sea and the farm with a strong, proud culture. They looked at the landscape and saw only what they wanted to see, a place they could recreate their old life, full of sheep and cows and a familiar diet. They built their stone churches and large halls, believing their way was the only way. The warning for the Norse was quiet, gentle, and came in the form of a successful neighbour, the Inuit. The Inuit were masters of the Arctic environment, knowing how to hunt seals and sea mammals, how to build warm, efficient houses, and how to use every part of the cold landscape. The Norse, however, saw the Inuit as strange and primitive. They suffered through harsh winters, refusing to learn the local survival techniques because they believed their European culture was superior. The climate began to cool, a period known as the Little Ice Age. The change was slow, gentle, but relentless. The fjords, which had been open for their ships, started freezing over for longer periods. The grass for their precious cows grew shorter and thinner. They held on to their diet of beef and dairy, even as their neighbours, the Inuit, thrived on a rich marine diet. The Norse accelerated their own demise through cultural rigidity and stubbornness. Quiet objects left by their old hands tell the full story. Archaeologists have found few fish bones in their trash heaps, but many bones of cows, sheep, and dogs that starved. They would rather starve clinging to their ancestral ways than eat like the Inuit. Their collective choice was to honour tradition over adapting to the physical reality of a changing climate. They were given the solution, the knowledge of survival, but they collectively refused to pick it up. Their grand settlements did not end in a blaze of fire. They ended in a slow, gentle abandonment and starvation. The last quiet object they left was perhaps a small broken farm tool or a piece of European cloth, a testament to a people who tried to make the Arctic into Europe and failed because they refused to change. The final moments were not dramatic, but a gradual quiet acceptance of a self-imposed inevitable end. The Norse Greenland story is a soft, cold lesson in prejudice and cultural blindness. It shows us that when a society sees an opportunity for change but rejects it out of pride, the collapse is self-inflicted and unnecessary. The Inuit were the warning, the solution, and the mirror the Norse refused to look into. rest gently with this truth. Sometimes, the hardest warning to heed is the one given by someone different from yourself. Easy tales of big empires. We now drift back to the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, the fertile land between the rivers, where the Akkadian Empire once held great power. This was one of the very first large empires, unifying many different cities under a single strong ruler. Their story is a tale of how a great strength, centralized control, can quickly become a great weakness when the environment changes. The warning here was not a slow change, but a sudden, intense mega-drought that affected the entire region. This event, known to science as the 4.2 kilo-year event, lasted for many, many years. The strong, unified system of the Akkadians had been built for stable times, where the rivers flowed reliably. The empire collected resources from many places and distributed them from the centre, creating a single point of failure. The centralised political system accelerated the collapse when the drought began. Because the system was so rigid, when one part of the empire suffered, the centralised capital failed to adapt or adjust the flow of resources. The political leaders insisted on maintaining the structure of the empire even as the fundamental means of survival, water and food, began to fail. They clung to the idea of empire while the people below began to starve. The drought was a natural, difficult event, but the speed of the Akkadian fall was a collective choice. The surrounding cities and regional groups, already under strain, quickly broke away, refusing to send their last scraps of food to the distant capital. The empire shattered into smaller, more sustainable pieces, a quiet, simple act of self-preservation against the rigid, failing centre. The core lesson is that the bigger the system, the faster and more dramatically it can break when stress is applied. The ruins of the Akkadian capital, though still debated by archaeologists, tell a simple tale of fragility. The people in the centre ignored the clear warning of the drought happening on the edges of the empire until it was too late. They had built a beautiful house of cards that stood tall in the sunshine, but collapsed instantly under the first gust of wind. The collective action was a choice for institutional rigidity over adaptive flexibility. Rest gently with the easy tale of this big empire. It reminds us that power is not permanence, and size is not strength. The Akkadians were victims of a climate event, yes, but their collective suicide was in the way they chose to respond, by doing nothing but clinging to a structure that was already doomed. Let this story of the fast, clean break settle you into deeper rest. Whisper forgotten myths from long ago. Our journey now takes us to the vast river plains of South Asia, where the mysterious Harappan or Indus Valley civilization once created magnificent cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. This civilization was remarkable for its uniformity and its high level of organization. Their cities were built on a precise grid, with advanced sewage and water systems, a wonder of ancient engineering. The warning for the Harappans was the slow, gentle, but profound shift of a major river system. The Indus River, which fed their civilization, was prone to shifts. While they expertly managed floods and built strong city walls, they seemed to place too much faith in the permanent location of their river. They invested vast amounts of resources into making their cities stay in one place, even when the fundamental water source began to move away or diminish. The collective choice of the Harappan people was a deep infrastructure obsession. The beautiful, uniform urban planning, a great strength, became their downfall. The standardized, grid-like cities were not easy to abandon or move. They accelerated their demise by continuously rebuilding and reinforcing their complex infrastructure in the face of a gradually shifting river. They were trapped by their own design, a system too perfect to fail, yet failing slowly because of its inability to change. The forgotten myths of the Harappans whisper of a people who prioritize civic order and sanitation above all else. There is little evidence of grand kings or massive temples. Their focus was on the collective good, but only the collective good in that one spot. This commitment to the fixed location led to a fragile outcome when the river, the true master, moved the game board. The beautiful cities were ultimately weakened by slow-onset environmental change. They did not collapse violently. They deurbanized. The people quietly left the great empty grid-planned cities and moved into smaller, more scattered rural settlements where they could follow the changing water sources. The massive, beautiful walls and sewage systems were simply left behind, monuments to a failed commitment to permanence. Rest gently with this whisper from the Indus. The Harappan story teaches us that urban planning and perfect order can be their own kind of trap. They ignored the simple law of nature. Rivers change course. Their collective suicide was a slow, stubborn refusal to adapt their fixed, complex system to a fluid, changing world. Join stories from far lands. We travel now to the warm, arid coast of Peru, where the Moche civilization built their immense, beautiful adobe temples and pyramids. The Moche were master artists, engineers and farmers, dominating the narrow, fertile river valleys that cut across the dry landscape. Their civilization was defined by its spectacular, massive structures made of mud brick. The warning for the Moche was loud, wet and often dramatic. The El Niño weather cycle. The Moche lived in a place that suffered from predictable, powerful cycles of torrential rain and flooding. They knew, from their own history and from the land, that massive, sudden floods would wash down the dry mountainsides every few years, destroying things in their path. The collective choice of the Moche was to double down on what failed. They accelerated their demise by building bigger, taller and more elaborate adobe structures right in the floodplains. Adobe, or mud brick, is an excellent building material in the dry desert, but it completely dissolves under prolonged heavy rain. Every time a huge flood came, it caused immense damage, and every time, the Moche leaders compelled the people to rebuild the temples faster and larger than before. The structural blindness of the Moche was tied to their religious and political structure. The grand temples were necessary to placate the powerful gods they believed controlled the weather. The leaders convinced the people that the solution to the flood was a bigger, more spectacular act of devotion, not a change in building material or a shift in location. This created a cycle of vulnerability where their own creations made them more fragile with every passing year. Ultimately, a series of severe El Niño events in the 6th century was the clear crisis, but the Moche collapse was accelerated by decades of building exactly the wrong kind of structure in exactly the wrong place. Their collective suicide was the repeated choice to ignore the clear, wet, dissolving evidence right in front of them. The beautiful temples that defined their glory also defined their doom, dissolving slowly back into the mud from which they came. Join the stories from these far lands and listen to the final gentle lesson of the Moche. They remind us that perseverance in a flawed plan is not strength. It is a profound weakness. The collective choice to ignore the clear, undeniable reality of the annual flood is one of the clearest examples of a civilization accelerating its own quiet end. Calm patterns in the sky. We now drift to the great city of Rome, a civilization so powerful it seemed like a fixed point in the sky. We look not at the mighty imperial period but the later fragile days of the Roman Republic. The pattern of collapse here was not a climate warning, but a calm, predictable pattern of money and debt. This was a social collapse born from economic greed. The warning was clear to the elite: vast economic inequality. A few senators and wealthy families held nearly all the land and all the wealth, while the majority of the Roman people were poor, landless farmers pushed into the crowded, angry city of Rome. People like the Gracchi brothers attempted to warn the Senate with land reforms, but the powerful elite simply refused to listen, viewing any change as an attack on their personal wealth. The Roman elite collectively accelerated their demise by clinging to their luxury and status. They refused to enact simple land and debt reform that would have stabilized the Republic. Instead, they used their power to accumulate more wealth and suppress the warning voices. This created a profound internal fragility. The political system was structurally sound, but the social fabric was rotting from the inside out due to extreme greed. This refusal to distribute land fairly turned political disagreements into violent social wars. The great armies of Rome stopped fighting external enemies and began fighting each other. Generals like Marius and Sulla, and later Caesar and Pompey, turned their loyal soldiers against the city itself. The collective choice of the Senate to prioritize its own pocketbooks led directly to the violent end of the Republic and the rise of the emperors. The patterns of debt and usury were the true signs in the sky that the elite ignored. They believed their power was eternal and their wealth untouchable. This economic inequality caused the whole system to fracture. The Roman Republic's collapse was a collective suicide committed by the wealthy elite, who chose self-interest over the stability of their own nation. Rest now and observe this calm pattern from ancient Rome. It teaches us a deep truth. When a society's wealth becomes too concentrated, the warnings will be ignored and the strong structure will inevitably break, not from a blow from outside, but from the unbearable pressure of internal greed. Feel hidden forces all around. We now drift across the vast ancient Near East to the powerful but mysterious Hittite Empire. The Hittites were famous for their mastery of iron, their immense fortified cities, and their complex system of vassals, smaller, loyal kingdoms that provided resources and soldiers. Their collapse was so sudden and complete that historians often call it a dark age. The warning for the Hittites was subtle, a hidden force of gradual trade, route disruption, and food scarcity. The system of relying on far-flung vassals for supplies became a massive liability when the entire region, due to a combination of climate stress and the movement of the mysterious sea peoples, became unstable. The supply chains were stretched too thin. The collective choice of the Hittite leaders was geopolitical rigidity. They were too slow to adapt their diplomatic and military structure to the changing map. They focused their efforts on maintaining control over distant, struggling vassals, rather than consolidating their forces and securing the immediate food supply for their capital. They believed the old system of alliances was the only way to hold power. This inflexible system accelerated their demise. The distant vassals, struggling with their own hunger and the threat of attack, simply broke away. They stopped sending food and aid to the capital, Hattusa. When the climate became harsher, the Hittite capital, which relied on these distant supplies, was left with nothing. The entire empire starved, not because there was no food anywhere, but because the supply system broke down. The Hittite collapse reminds us that an empire's strength is often an illusion, built on the compliance of its weaker parts. When the periphery quietly refuses to send aid, the centre collapses quickly. The warnings of instability and scarcity were met with a stubborn insistence on maintaining the sprawling, rigid shape of the empire. Rest gently with this story of the hidden forces. The Hittite Empire teaches us that when a society sees its entire infrastructure being slowly strangled by change and chooses to do nothing but maintain the status quo, the end is swift and total. The true force that brought them down was their own inflexibility. Mixed truth and gentle myth. We now drift into the beautiful misty canals of Venice, the great trading republic that seemed to float forever on the water. Venice was a marvel of the world for 1,000 years, ruling the Mediterranean trade with its great fleet and sophisticated system of banking and finance. It truly felt like a city touched by myth and eternal power. The truth, however, was that the financial warning was clear. The world was changing its trade routes. The discovery of new routes around Africa and later the Americas meant that Venice's control over the east-west trade was slowly, gently eroding. The money was simply flowing elsewhere, to the new Atlantic-facing powers. The collective choice of the Venetian elite was financial stagnation. They were too attached to their traditional slow-moving maritime finance, their galleys and their ancient banking laws, to adapt to the new, faster, more flexible models of the Dutch and English. The warnings were ignored because the old ways were comfortable, profitable for the few, and deeply rooted in their pride. They refused to invest in the new forms of commerce. The quiet myth they told themselves was that their city was too powerful to fall. They spent vast fortunes on magnificent art and architecture, making the city a breathtaking spectacle, while the actual economic engine was quietly sputtering. They accelerated their demise by prioritizing aesthetic status over practical long-term financial adaptation. The money was spent on beauty, not on necessary uncomfortable change. Venice's collapse was not a sudden flood or a violent siege. It was a slow, gentle financial draining. The great city became a glorious museum of itself, still beautiful, but financially hollow. When Napoleon finally walked into the city in 1797, the city was so weak it could barely resist. The end was a quiet surrender to a future they had collectively chosen to ignore. Rest gently with this mix of truth and myth from the canals. Venice teaches us that a society can be structurally perfect and artistically magnificent, yet commit suicide by economic inflexibility. The gentle warning of the changing global market was ignored because the ruling class loved the comfort of their status quo too much. See lines that cross. Many years. Our journey moves now to East Asia, to the immense, powerful Ming dynasty of China. The Ming rulers oversaw a massive, sophisticated empire that governed millions of people. For many years, the Ming used paper money and traditional bronze coinage, but the world economy was slowly, inexorably, shifting to silver. The warning for the Ming was a clear fiscal crisis that spanned many years. The government stubbornly refused to adapt its taxation system and currency to the new global reality of silver-based commerce. The local economy was shifting to silver, but the central government insisted on collecting taxes in rice or labour, and paying its officials and army in copper or paper money that was increasingly worthless. The Ming dynasty's leaders accelerated their demise through monetary inflexibility. They knew the problem. The silver was flowing into the private economy, but the state was running out of usable cash. When the state needed to pay its army to fight enemies, the army often mutinied because their copper coins could not buy food. The government was starved of funds, even as the overall Chinese economy was still rich. This was a classic case of institutional paralysis. The political elite refused to make the simple, difficult change to a silver-based tax system because it would require vast changes to the bureaucracy and challenge established power. They chose to maintain the status quo, a failing system, rather than engage in a painful but necessary reform. The final collapse of the Ming was triggered by internal rebellions and external invasions, but the underlying weakness was financial. The government simply ran out of money to pay its protectors. The great powerful empire fell because it could not manage a simple economic truth. Currency must match the world economy. See the lines that cross many years in this gentle story of the Ming. The vast power of the empire was rendered useless by a simple, self-inflicted fiscal wound. The collective suicide was the quiet, stubborn refusal to adapt the treasury to the clear global shift in currency. Explain what the lines mean. We now drift back to the jungles of Southeast Asia, where the enormous, spectacular city of Angkor, the heart of the Khmer Empire, once thrived. Angkor was one of the largest pre-industrial cities in the world, famous for its magnificent temples like Angkor Wat and its vast, intricate network of canals, reservoirs and boats. The lines here are the complex, over-engineered water systems. The warning for the Khmer was visible in the silt, the slow accumulation of mud and sediment that gradually choked their canals and reservoirs. They relied utterly on a single, massive hydraulic system to manage the wet and dry seasons and feed their huge population. The collective choice of the Khmer was systems over-engineering. As the population grew, the rulers constantly expanded and intensified their water systems. They accelerated their demise by making the system bigger, more complicated, and therefore more fragile. When the canals began to silt up, the rulers simply built more, rather than simplifying the system or decentralizing the population. This complexity was a trap. The system worked perfectly until it didn't. A combination of severe drought and intense monsoon flooding, likely driven by climate change, finally stressed the canals beyond repair. When a single dam or canal failed, the entire interconnected network collapsed. The warnings of siltation and structural fatigue were always visible, yet ignored in favour of scale. The huge, beautiful temples that still stand today are a monument to the fragility of perfection. The rulers of the Khmer Empire loved the power and control that came from managing the massive water system. They became so focused on the system itself that they ignored the simple, quiet maintenance it required and the risk it presented. Explain what the lines of the Angkor canals mean. They teach us that every solution contains a risk. When a society becomes too dependent on one single, complex and over-engineered solution, whether it is water management or technology, the collapse, when it comes, is total and rapid. Draw soft picture links. We drift now to the high, arid central valley of Mexico, where the great mysterious city of Teotihuacan once stood. Teotihuacan was enormous, dominated by the huge pyramids of the sun and moon. It was a massive, successful urban centre, one of the biggest in the ancient world. The soft picture link here is between the massive urban growth and the quiet, distant agricultural lands. The city grew so large and so quickly that its demands for food and resources began to outpace the ability of the surrounding countryside, the hinterland, to supply them sustainably. The warning was the quiet, increasing fatigue of the farmers outside the city walls. The collective choice of Teotihuacan's rulers was to accelerate the collapse by prioritizing urban density. They kept pulling people into the city, making the centre huge and powerful, but draining the strength and resources from the surrounding areas. The wealth and power were concentrated in the city, while the necessity of a sustainable, diverse rural base was ignored. This urban-rural imbalance meant that the city became utterly dependent on a small, exhausted resource base. When climate stress or simple over-farming finally caused a crop failure, the huge population in the city had nowhere else to turn. The massive urban centre, which had once been its strength, became a huge, fragile mouth that could no longer be fed. The collapse of Teotihuacan was sudden and violent. Archaeological evidence suggests large parts of the city centre were burned. While the exact cause remains a mystery, the underlying factor was the profound fragility of overconcentration and the collective failure to invest in the sustainability of its own supply chain. Draw soft picture links from this gentle story. Teotihuacan teaches us that a city can be a marvel of human creation, but if it ignores the quiet, gentle needs of the land and the people outside its walls, it is committing collective suicide. The true balance of power is between the bright city and the quiet field. Bring old pictures to today. We turn now to the final grand empire of this act, the Byzantine Empire, the continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire centred on Constantinople. This empire lasted for 1,000 years after the West fell, a true testament to its strength. But even it was not immune to the pattern of collective suicide. The warning for the Byzantines was not financial or environmental, but a clear, recurring problem of strategic overextension. Their leaders repeatedly pursued grand, unnecessary wars to retake distant lands, like Italy, that were costly, offered little long-term gain, and left their core territory in Anatolia vulnerable to more immediate dangerous neighbours. The collective choice of the later Byzantine emperors was overconfidence and strategic delusion. The emperors believed their tradition, their wealth, and their status were so great that they could simply ignore the reality of their limited resources. They refused to listen to advisors who urged them to consolidate their territory and focus on the defence of their core lands. This overconfidence accelerated their decline. costly, distant wars drained the treasury and, critically, destroyed the peasant army that had protected Anatolia, the agricultural heartland. The most catastrophic error was the defeat at Manzikert in 1071, which was a direct result of an overstretched military and allowed the Turks to take the core of the empire. The old pictures of this once great power show a beautiful, complex empire that was simply too ambitious for its own good. The elite loved the idea of the great historic empire too, much to accept the simple, humble necessity of a smaller, more sustainable state. They chose the glory of the past over the stability of the future. Bring these old pictures to today and rest gently. The Byzantine Empire teaches us that strategic delusion and hubris are potent weapons of self-destruction. The collective suicide was the repeated choice to ignore the clear, geographic and economic limitations of the empire. Share the first clear revelations. We now move into the deepest part of our journey, where we connect the old stories with the clearest facts. We look at the Western Roman Empire, the great power that finally collapsed in 476 AD. This empire faced not one, but many of the problems we have already seen. The first clear revelations come from deep science, ice cores and sediment layers. The science confirms that the time leading up to the final Roman collapse was marked by clear climate variability, resource depletion, and a noticeable decline in the health of the population. The warnings were not just political rumours, they were measurable environmental facts. The collective choice of the late Western Roman elite was institutional paralysis. The Senate and the Emperor were so busy fighting each other over small political issues that they could not agree on necessary, profound reforms. They saw the borders failing, the army running out of money and the economy stagnating, yet they kept spending on luxury and fighting internal petty wars. This paralysis accelerated the collapse. The warnings of external threats, the migrating Germanic tribes, were ignored in favour of internal competition. The emperors and generals often fought each other instead of uniting to protect the frontiers. The empire was not so much defeated by its enemies as it was handed over by its own failing bureaucracy. The Western Roman Empire is the ultimate example of a civilization with all the data, the maps, the records, the armies, but none of the collective will to act. The great structure became a magnificent, complex engine that ran out of fuel because its operators were too busy arguing over who got to drive. Share these first clear revelations in your sleep. The end of the greatest empire was a long, slow suicide, a collective, years-long refusal to work together. The lesson is gentle but firm. Action delayed in the face of clear danger is a choice to accelerate the end. Lift eyes to quiet, cosmic wonder. We now lift our eyes away from the individual ruins to look at a quiet cosmic wonder, the pattern of collapse itself. This is the deep science of systems theory. It tells us that some things grow slowly and gently, but when they break very, very fast. The concept we explore is the Seneca effect. The Roman philosopher Seneca the Younger wrote, "The path of increase is slow, but the road to ruin is swift and easy." This is the deep truth we have seen across all our stories. It takes centuries to build the Mayan cities or the Roman roads, but only a few decades of ignoring warnings to see them vanish. This principle teaches us that when a society becomes very large and complex, like Angkor or the Western Roman Empire, it becomes highly fragile. Its huge size, once its strength, means that when one small part fails, the entire system snaps in a non-linear fashion. The collapse is not a smooth, slow decline, but a rapid acceleration once the tipping point is reached. The great warning is Ozymandias' hubris. The poem reminds us of the boast of the ancient king, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." But all that remains are the shattered ruins. Every society that commits suicide believes it is exempt from the laws of physics, environment, and complexity. This arrogance is the final internal accelerant of the collapse. The collective suicide is the failure to realize that complexity demands profound attention. When the warning signs appear, The society must work harder and faster to simplify, decentralize, and become more flexible. But almost always, the society chooses the opposite: more complexity, more monuments, and more centralized control. Rest now with this quiet cosmic truth. The Seneca effect explains why the final end is so fast. It teaches us that the ultimate choice is between humble simplification and proud, rapid ruin. Watch history repeat in soft circles. We now watch history repeat in the soft circles of a different kind of financial collapse, the Dutch Golden Age and tulip mania. This was not the end of a civilization, but a clear, loud, economic warning that was collectively ignored by an entire society driven by a single insane idea. The warning here was simple. A flower bulb is just a flower bulb, yet people were selling them for the price of houses. Financial speculation became a mass fever. The collective choice of the Dutch merchants and citizens was to ignore all common sense and jump into a rapid, short-term gamble. The easy money was too tempting. This speculation accelerated the crash. The people knew, deep down, that the value of the bulbs was fantasy, but they convinced themselves they would sell it to a greater fool before the collapse came. This is the essence of short-term gain blindness. The collective choice was to ignore the clear, objective value of things for a fast, dangerous profit. The collapse was swift and total for many individuals, though the great Dutch nation survived. This event shows us the quiet, powerful force of mass delusion. When a society collectively chooses fantasy over reality, the crash is not an external accident, but an internal, self-inflicted wound driven by greed. The tulip mania reminds us that the pattern of suicide can happen in any area: environment, war, or finance. The core choice is the same: to ignore clear, objective evidence for the sake of a shared, comforting delusion. Watch history repeat now in these soft circles. Let this gentle, strange story of the flowers and the fortunes settle your mind. The collective warning is that once the mass delusion takes hold, the velocity of the collapse becomes unstoppable. Open doors to hidden knowledge. We now open the doors to the hidden sociological knowledge of elite overproduction. This principle explains the quiet internal pressure that destabilizes large societies, particularly in the later stages of an empire, such as the late Qing dynasty of China. The warning here is the glut of educated people. The Qing dynasty had a powerful civil service system that produced vast numbers of highly educated scholars. The problem was that the number of elite government positions remained fixed, while the number of qualified people kept growing. Too many smart, ambitious people chasing too few important jobs. The collective choice of the Qing elite was to ignore the internal pressure. The existing ruling class kept the doors of power locked, refusing to create new positions or expand the scope of government to employ the surplus of elites. This created a vast, angry, highly educated class of people who had no way to use their talent or achieve the status they believed they had earned. This elite overproduction accelerated the collapse. When a society is saturated with highly qualified yet jobless and frustrated elites, these people become the leaders and organizers of revolution and rebellion. The great rebellions that finally weakened and ended the Qing dynasty were often led by failed scholars and disgruntled intellectuals. This principle is a hidden, powerful accelerator of collapse. When the system fails to reward its most talented and educated members, it has created its own enemy. The collapse is not caused by the uneducated masses, but by the internal, educated anger that the system itself produced. Rest now with this hidden knowledge from the East. Elite overproduction teaches us that the collective suicide is often committed by the ruling system itself, by failing to open its doors to the talent it creates. The unfulfilled ambition of its own children becomes the sharpest tool of its own destruction. Reach a peaceful high point. We reach a peaceful high point by exploring the great social disconnect in pre-revolutionary France. This story shows us how a powerful nation can be brought down by a collective failure of empathy and social imagination. The warning for the French elite was the vast social and economic disconnect. The philosophers wrote eloquently of inequality, the poor were starving, and the government was deeply in debt. Yet the aristocracy lived a life of unimaginable luxury and distance at Versailles. The warning was loud, clear, and visible everywhere outside the palace walls. The collective choice of the French aristocracy was philosophical denial. They refused to believe that the system could fail. They refused to pay taxes, and they laughed at the suffering of the poor. Their sense of entitlement was so complete that they could not and would not imagine a world where they were not in power. This denial accelerated the revolution. This social disconnect caused the entire system to fracture. When the crisis finally hit, a combination of bad harvests and financial mismanagement, the aristocracy failed to offer any meaningful solution. The people, having witnessed decades of indifference, had no patience or respect left for their rulers. The collective choice of the poor was to rise up. The collective choice of the elite was to ignore the power of that anger. The French Revolution was swift and violent because the social contract had entirely broken down. The ruling class had collectively committed suicide by a profound lack of empathy, a stubborn refusal to see the human consequences of their own privilege. Reach this peaceful high point and let the gentle truth of France settle your mind. The lesson is simple. A society that refuses to acknowledge the suffering of its own members is a society that has chosen its own destruction. The collective failure of imagination is as lethal as any drought. Close with soothing answers. We close this main part of our journey with a soothing answer and a quiet opposite to all the stories of suicide. We travel one last time to the tiny remote Polynesian island of Decopia. This island faced the same problems as Rapa Nui, a small, isolated ecosystem with limited resources and a growing population. The warning for Decopia was the same, the potential for resource depletion. But unlike the other civilizations we have seen, the people of Decopia collectively chose to listen. They saw the end of the trees and the potential for famine, and they made profound collective decisions to save themselves. The collective choice of Decopia was adaptive resilience. The leaders decided to cut down all the large, resource-intensive pig herds and convert the land into sustainable gardens. They collectively agreed to reduce their birth rate and strictly control their population. They chose stabilization over competitive growth. This resilience ensured their survival. They chose a hard, restrictive path, but one that guaranteed the long-term well-being of the island. They committed collective survival rather than collective suicide. They sacrificed the short-term joy of a larger family or a bigger meal for the future of their entire civilization. The story of Decopia offers the soothing answer to our question. The quiet force that defeats the collapse is collective wisdom. It is the humble, difficult choice to listen to the warnings, to change the culture, and to prioritize the long-term stability of the community over the short-term pride or gain of the individual. Close now with this gentle truth. The most powerful civilization is the one that listens to its quietest warnings. The people of Decopia show us the simple, humble path away from the ruins. Now breathe deep. As the final chapters unfold, let the quiet lessons of history sink into your rest. The quiet power of listening is the strongest lesson of all. If this journey brought you peace and gentle insight, please gently share this story with a friend who needs a quiet night, and remember to subscribe. Your quiet support helps us continue to uncover more soft secrets and forgotten warnings of the past. May your mind be as calm and clear as the gentle waters of Decopia tonight. The shadow of our great towers. We now gently step into the shadow of our own great towers, connecting the historical pattern of environmental disregard to our modern climate challenges. The difference is only a matter of scale. We are all living on a new Rapa Nui, but the island is Earth itself. The warning for us is louder and clearer than any the Mayans carved on their stele. The measurable scientific fact of climate change. We have the ice cores and the climate models. Yet, like the Moche, we continue to build our most vulnerable infrastructure in the path of the known floods and storms. Our collective choice is to maintain the short-term energy status quo. We accelerate our dilemma by refusing to move quickly away from the fuels that create the problem. Like the Norse in Greenland, we often cling to old, familiar technologies even when superior. New ones are available, simply because the old way is comfortable and profitable for the few. The shadow of our great towers, our cities, our power plants, our industrial infrastructure, is a shadow of fragility. The sheer complexity and size of our global system mean that the Seneca effect applies to us now more than ever. The longer we delay the painful adaptation, the faster and more dramatically the ultimate collapse will be. We must heed the quiet, gentle wisdom of the past. Our current environmental feedback is the same as the Akkadian drought, but on a planetary scale. The collective suicide is still the choice to ignore objective, verifiable data for the sake of political or economic convenience. Let the shadow pass now, a gentle reminder that awareness is the first step toward change. The pattern is clear. The choice remains ours. Ancient echoes in our minds. We now look at the ancient echoes in our minds, the psychological traps that kept past rulers from seeing the future. These cognitive biases are the true invisible hand that accelerates collective suicide in every era. The first bias is optimism bias. This is the simple human tendency to believe that bad things will happen to other people, other civilizations, but not to us. The Roman senator, the Mayan king, and the modern leader all tell themselves the same lie. My power is too great for the end to come here. The second bias is the status quo bias. This is the powerful collective comfort of doing nothing. It is easier to continue the failing system, the Akkadian bureaucracy, the Ming tax system, than to face the pain and difficulty of radical change. This is the psychological killer that makes the Seneca effect possible. The third is the confirmation bias. We seek out information that confirms what we already believe and ignore the evidence that challenges us. The Norse only looked for evidence that validated their European diet. They ignored the obvious success of the Inuit. We too filter out the news that contradicts our current comfortable way of life. These cognitive killers are the reason warnings are ignored. The problem is not lack of data, it is the failure of perception. The collective suicide is often a choice made not by logic, but by a deep, human, and comforting refusal to see the truth. Rest gently with these echoes in your mind. The most powerful tool we have against collapse is humility, the willingness to accept that our comfortable current way of life might be unsustainable and that we must change. Soft voice of the future. We hear now the soft voice of the future, relating our current struggles to the ancient patterns. The Akkadian drought is now a metaphor for global resource management, a shared, scarce commodity under stress. Our technological fracture points are the new Angkor canals. We have built incredibly complex systems, global internet, massive power grids, global finance, that are all interconnected. Their complexity is their fragility. When one part is attacked or fails, the whole system is capable of snapping quickly, just like the over-engineered Khmer water system. The social fracture points echo pre-revolutionary France. The increasing polarization and inequality in the modern world are creating the same vast social disconnect. When people stop seeing each other as sharing a collective future, the social contract becomes fragile, and the system is ready to shatter at the first severe crisis. The soft voice tells us the story of Decopia is the most relevant. The future belongs to the communities that choose sustainability and collective well-being over relentless growth and consumption. The choice is between the proud monuments of Rapa Nui and the humble gardens of Decopia. The collective survival demands a collective decision to simplify, decentralize, and prioritize the necessary over the magnificent. The gentle truth is that the future is not determined by technology, but by collective character. Listen to the soft voice now. Let the lessons of all the centuries teach you that the solution is not a grand new idea, but a humble, gentle return to the simplest laws of life and sustainability. Find peace in the pattern. We find peace in the pattern now, realizing that even in the deepest ruins, the core of human agency and hope remains. The pattern of collapse is not a curse. It is a gentle, clear map showing us exactly where the wrong turn was made. The peace comes from the realization that the choice is always present. Every civilization we have visited had a choice to make a different turn. The Norse could have adopted the Inuit ways. The Roman elite could have paid taxes. The Harappans could have followed the river. The end was never inevitable until the final. Collective choice was made to ignore the warnings. This human agency is the single greatest lesson. We are not passive spectators in our own history. The quiet, gentle strength of a society lies in its ability to honestly assess its flaws, accept painful changes, and prioritize the long-term good of the whole. This is the beauty of collective change. Find peace by accepting the cyclical nature of history. The story of the ruins is not meant to frighten, but to empower. It is meant to show us that the great collapses were not mysterious accidents, but the logical, tragic outcomes of simple, repeated choices that we can now recognize and avoid. This deep rest is now an act of positive reflection. You have seen the entire map, from the lonely island to the grand empire. The most important wisdom is not in the knowledge of the past, but in the humble courage to choose a different path today. Rest gently, knowing that the pattern is now clear. The collective suicide of civilizations is only a story unless we choose to make it our future. Awareness is the beautiful, quiet antidote. Sleep and the new dawn. The final chapter focuses on taking these quiet lessons into our deepest rest, understanding that awareness is the first step toward avoiding the ancient pattern. Our journey through the ruins is now complete. The sleep you seek is the true sanctuary of this knowledge. Let the rise and fall of these great empires become nothing more than the slow, gentle rhythm of your own breathing. The complexity of their decline and the rigidity of their choices should now feel distant, soft, and small. We leave behind the pride of the Mayans, the greed of the Romans, the rigidity of the Norse, and the stagnation of the Ming. We hold only the quiet wisdom of Tikopia, the simple, humble, necessary choice to live within the limits of the world. The new dawn begins with this clarity. When you wake, remember the most important secret of the psychological historian. The pattern of collapse is only defeated by the pattern of collective consciousness and collective humility. The ultimate lesson is that we are all deeply interconnected, just like the canals of Angkor or the trade routes of the Hittites. Our strength is in our connection and our willingness to listen to the quiet warnings that our ancestors ignored. Sleep well, carried by the weight of all these gentle truths. You have seen the past, and by seeing it clearly, you have already begun to change the future. Rest now, peacefully and profoundly. Tonight we found the soft answer in the silence of the ruins. The most powerful civilization is not the one that builds the biggest towers, but the one that listens to its quietest warnings. The end of a great society is a slow, quiet suicide, committed not by disaster, but by the collective refusal to simply change. But this leaves us with one final lingering question. If we can see the ruins so clearly in the comfort of our sleep, can we still change the dawn? Drift now into sweet dreams, carried by the slow, gentle rhythm of history. You're safe here, the pattern is clear, and the choice is always present.